Welcome. So thank you for spending your time this evening to learn more about server virtualization and private cloud. So my name's Daniel Meyer. I work for a company called Infront Consulting. So we're a kind of a local SI dealing with virtualization and system management technologies. Also the secretary for the Enterprise Cloud Computing and Virtualization SIG. So this is an SCS special interest group. So if you're interested in joining, I have a link at the end which you can all kind of get on and join and learn more about cloud computing. Okay, let's get straight in. So firstly, let's define what private cloud is first. So private cloud, I see here, is four key tenets of private cloud. So you talk about pooled resources. So when you talk about pooled resources, we pool our compute, network, and storage resources. We talk about self-service. Now, whenever you hear self-service from a cloud perspective, I want you to think, I need to access this from a web page. So if I can access it from a web page, I can literally use any device, mobile phone, tablet, kind of ultrabook to access this. Then we talk about elastic, so growing and shrinking with demand. So we want to be able to scale as demand increases and shrink as demand decreases. And the last part is really about usage-based. This is chargeback. So I consume this amount of resources. I want to be charged back on those resources that I actually consume, not on a flat rate, for instance. Now, those four key tenets of the private cloud, or four key tenets apply across cloud. So private, public. Now, one thing that we differentiate is with private cloud. So private cloud I want to define as anything internal to your organization. So with private cloud, we have two things, control and customization. So we have control over the infrastructure. We can customize it, which is different from a public cloud offering. A public cloud offering, we subscribe to a service. We don't have control over that. The person that provides that service controls that. That person, that public cloud offering, we can't really customize as well. They're off the shelf. We buy this package or this package, for instance. So that's what private cloud's all about. We talk about the four key tenets and control and customization. So we're trying to build these private cloud infrastructures in our organizations. So one of the key requirements is having a platform to build this on. And that's what we'll be talking about today, is the hypervisors, or the infrastructure, the virtual infrastructure that we need to select to build our private clouds. So I'm going to focus on four of them, well actually three of them. I'll talk about the fourth one and why that's there. So you may have heard of some of these names before. Any of you deployed these in your organizations? Citrix? VMware? Show of hands? A couple of you? Microsoft? Anyway, we'll talk more about all of these hypervisors. So a little bit of history. So Gartner Magic Quadrant. Everyone probably knows what Gartner is and the Magic Quadrant is. So all companies want to end up here in the leaders square. So if we look at the date here, May 2010. So you can see that VMware is the really the only player in the leaders quadrant here. So step forward in time. Okay. So stepping forward in time, we moved to 2011, June 2011. You can see immediately that Microsoft and Citrix joined VMware in the leaders quadrant. So now Gartner sees three leaders in the industry. You see Oracle still down here. Actually, if we step back, you can see there's other players here. And moving to 2011, you can see some players have dropped out. Now moving to 2012, you see that Oracle has moved up from being a niche player to a challenger. Citrix has gone back slightly, and Microsoft has moved further ahead. VMware, you didn't actually see it, but it went back slightly from a Gartner perspective. So let's move to this year, 2013. And 2013, let's see the transition. Citrix has moved back into being a visionary now. They're no longer a leader. And we see Microsoft moving further up to VMware. So Microsoft moved from here up to here. Citrix went from here to here, back down to here, and Oracle moved up. VMware hovered around the leader square. It's always been a leader. Right? So that's the state of play today. So if you look at this chart it is today, you can see it's probably just it's a two-horse race, Microsoft or VMware. So let's drill down deeper into each of these vendors and a bit of history behind them all. So we'll start with Citrix. So Citrix current release is 6.2 in 2013. It's been based on this open source Xen Hypervisor, and it was created back in 2003. They acquired that company, or they acquired XenServer, the open source, in 2007, and then they made their product free. And the animation's it's a bit hard to read, but this is free. They made their product free, so you could actually use it for free. 2009. So some of the key benefits of XenServer, it's open source again. So they announced that 6.2. You can use it for free. You don't have to pay any money to use it. Right? You pay money to get support for it. It's simple to install. They have this saying, 10 to Xen. From having a bare metal server to having a Xen running on there, XenServer, is 10 to Xen. And we have a free tool to manage that called XenCenter. You can see some pricing down here. So this is really for support, and it's a per socket based licensing. One thing that XenServer used to have over the other competitors, it used to have a per server licensing model. Now most servers today come with 2 sockets, so by having a per server licensing model, they could be slightly cheaper than the other products out there. And one of the biggest deployments in Singapore is this Alatum. You can look at the website. They kind of based their whole cloud infrastructure on XenServer. So one thing about Xen is if you've got a lot of Linux workloads, then this is the type of hypervisor you're looking at, because there's very strong Linux support for this platform. Okay, so move on now to Microsoft. So Microsoft, everyone probably knows Microsoft. You're probably using some Microsoft operating system somewhere. So Microsoft evolved over time. The current release is Windows 2012, Hyper-V. Their product is called Hyper-V. They used to have a product called Virtualserver. This is when they first entered the server virtualization game. And Virtualserver was what we call a Type 2 hypervisor. It needed an operating system to run on. So the rest of the hypervisors I'm talking about here are all Type 1 hypervisors. So they just run on top of the bare metal, or what they call bare metal hypervisors. So Hyper-V actually came about in 2008, and that was their Type 1 hypervisor. So with the release of Windows Server 2008 came Hyper-V, and that was their server virtualization platform. So if you look at how long they've been in the market, well, it's 2003 now, it's maybe five years, going on 6 years. So within that space of 6 years, they've deployed new versions, and the current release is Windows 2012, which was released in September last year. They are going to release a new version of this called Windows Server 2012 R2 in October 17. So Microsoft's going to have a big launch event at Expo, so if you want to go along to that and learn more about that, you can sign up for that. So one thing about Hyper-V is it's good for Microsoft workloads. So if you're doing a lot of Microsoft workloads like SharePoint, SQL, Exchange, it's very much optimized for those type of workloads. One thing is most people think that when you install Hyper-V, you install Windows Server, and then it's like running a server operating system. But you can actually have different installation methods for Hyper-V. There's things like Core, and that will turn it to just having a command line interface. And then full installation is you get all the GUIs like IE, you get Windows Explorer, and so on. How we manage this is using the System Center suite of products. So this is a management stack from Microsoft. You do have to pay money for this. And in terms of licensing, we have Data Center and Standard Edition. So we'll go a bit more into this when I go through a cost scenario. So I'll go through a cost scenario of all these three platforms, and you can see it for yourself. So the strong ecosystem support for Windows. They have growing support for Linux now, but probably not as much as what you see with XenServer. Okay. So Oracle VM. Who knew that Oracle actually has a virtualization platform? Well, they do, and again, it's based on the Xen Hypervisor. So current version is 3.2, and they also have Oracle virtualization for Spark and Solaris. Obviously Oracle bought Sun, so it's one of the reasons why they have this type of support. They manage using Oracle VM and the Enterprise Manager as well, but it's very much like XenServer because it's based on the Xen Hypervisor. They charge for support. Again, it's a free product. You just pay money for support. And one thing I will talk about is the licensing support for Oracle applications. We'll get deeper into why this exists and why customers deploy it. And lastly, the big player, the leader that's been around for over 10 years is VMware. So VMware first released in version 1, ESX. Anyone here deployed ESX? No? Anyone heard of ESX? Anyone know what ESX stands for? ESX, I'll just divert for a second here. ESX, the acronyms for ESX is Electric Sky. Now, if you think about what we're talking about here, we're talking about clouds. Back in 2001, they coined this term Electric Sky. The marketing people did. But Electric Sky didn't sound right. It needed to be more technical, so they added the X. So it became Electric Sky, just use the initials ES and then X. So that's how they came up with ESX back in 2001. And if you think about where we are today with cloud, Electric Sky kind of has some bearing on that term cloud. They also had a product called GSX as well, and that was actually, GSX was Groundstorm, GS, and they added the X to make it more technical. So Groundstorm again, talking about clouds. So where we are today with VMware, they just announced last week their latest release, 5.5, and it is the most mature in the market, most widely deployed in the market. It's been around for a long time. They do have a strong management stack as well. And their licensing, they have different editions. They used to license on this thing called VRAM. So you used to license on how much RAM you had in your server. This lasted about 1 or 2, well, not more than 2 years. The customers didn't like this. So you'll find that most licensing is based on per socket licensing. So how many physical CPUs you have in your server. Again, strong ecosystem with Windows and Linux support as well. Okay, so we're going to evaluate these three platforms now. I'm going to drop VMware. I'm going to drop Oracle VM out of the picture here, and we're going to compare Citrix with Microsoft with VMware. And we're going to look at it from different aspects. We're going to look at it the scalability and support. What type of workloads can we support? How big can those workloads be? We're going to look at some of the features that they provide and workloads type of vendor support for the software on there. And then we'll look at a cost equation and licensing. So compare all of these, and then we'll see which is more suitable. So if we look at the current versions, we're just looking at the current versions, what's currently available today. So host support, they're fairly much even across all vendors. So what does this actually mean? 320 logical processors, 4 terabytes of RAM. Well, 4 terabytes of RAM you probably can understand. It's a server with 4 terabytes of RAM. But 320 logical processors. How do you come up with logical processors? Now, you've probably heard of cores, and you've probably heard of hyperthreading. So I'll give an example. Let's say we take a 2-socket machine, that's 2 physical die, with 6 cores, and with hyperthreading. So to calculate the number of logical processors there, we take 2 physical CPUs, times the number of cores, so 2 times 6 is 12 cores, and 12 cores with hyperthreading. Hyperthreading is another logical processor, so you double it. So 12 becomes 24. So with this 2-socket, 6-core machine, we get 24 logical processors. So you can probably imagine what type of server has 32 logical processors. Something with maybe 4-way or an 8-way machine with 10-core type CPUs, which is not commonplace. You don't walk into your vendors and ask for something like this. So really, the hardware limitations are not a concern for us. Maybe for Citrix, 1 terabyte of RAM is compared to the rest. Then we look at our workloads. So we want to host VMs on top of our hosts. So our workload specs, our support, 64 virtual CPUs for our VM. Now, you look at this, they're fairly much equal. So again, even playing field when it comes to VM support. It wasn't the case though. Microsoft in the last generation, 2008 R2, could only support 4 virtual CPUs. They jumped from 4 to 64 in Windows 2012. And VMware just recently went from 32 to 64. So these specs are always improving. But the key to note here is you don't have workloads that require this type of performance. Right? You're not going to create a virtual machine that requires 64 virtual CPUs that uses 1 terabyte of RAM. What I see in the market today is 4 virtual CPUs, maybe about 8 gig of RAM is good enough for most workloads. Talk about the size of VMs on a host. What this number is telling you is I'm running 1,024 virtual machines on a single piece of hardware. Would you do that? Probably not. It's scaling numbers that you won't typically hit. Though clustering, though, we might hit, but not in a Singapore context. Probably US, where they have larger requirements for IT, but in Singapore, the largest cluster or node of virtualization hosts I've come across is about 16 today. And then we see the management tools here. So really, the summary of this is, in terms of scalability and support, they're all about the same. You can see Citrix lags somewhat, but from a Microsoft and VMware perspective, you've got even footings here. And they recently introduced this, what we call VHD as virtual hard disk. VMDK is a VM disk. It's how Microsoft and VMware term their virtual disk technology. But we can have a disk of up to 62 terabytes. That's bigger than some SAN environments that you buy today. So what does that mean? I'm encapsulating data into a file that can grow to 62 terabytes or 64 terabytes. This is important to us because data is growing every day. Every year data increases. We need to have support for this. Okay, so now we move on to guest OS support. So XenServer supports, you can see a large number of Linux distributions. It's built from open source, so it supports a lot of the Linux distributions. So very comprehensive support. And good support from a vCPU point of view. So you can create large Linux workloads with any of the Xen-based hypervisors. This kind of applies to Oracle VM as well. But in reality, right, if we're deploying private cloud in our organizations, we're typically looking at the latest versions. So as long as we have support for the latest versions, that's what we're kind of focusing on. Latest versions of Linux, latest versions of Windows. So we look at Hyper-V. Hyper-V has good support as well for some more of the Linux distributions and good support for Windows as well. So I put here Windows Server 2000. Not sure if any of you are still running 2000 in your environments. I do know some customers in Singapore still running 2000. That's not actually officially supported by Microsoft anymore. July 13th is when 2000 got dropped from support. And the next one to be dropped from support is Windows 2003. That's going to be dropped from support in July 2015. So if you've got 2003 workloads running today, you might want to consider upgrading them or moving them on. One thing to note here is that because a lot of these operating systems actually came about before virtualization became mainstream, they don't have good support in terms of the virtual CPUs. So you should follow these guidelines when you actually do virtualize these workloads. A 2000 server shouldn't have more than one virtual CPU assigned to it. So this is important when you're building your private cloud and maybe you need to migrate legacy applications into your cloud and host them there. Any of the new operating systems here, you see Windows 2012, up to 64 virtual CPUs I can support there. So some of the key gotchas when you're actually migrating workloads into your virtualization stack. And lastly, look at VMware. Well, there's too many to note here. In fact, there's actually on their website, they have support for 315 operating systems, different operating systems, from all the versions of Windows to Linux and so on, and even Unix with Solaris. So in terms of support for operating systems, it looks like VMware has the most. But is that important to us? We look at this. So the extract from the website, 315 results. They had NT4 on the list. They had 95, 98 on the list. These operating systems probably you will not be deploying these days. So the key here to note is, do these hypervisors or these virtualization platforms have support for the latest versions or the latest one less version, well, latest one less than the current version? Because those are the type of versions you'll be deploying in your private cloud. And that's where to focus on. And all three of these platforms have good support for that. So, yeah, I asked the question, which guest OSs would you be deploying in your private cloud? Is it going to be more Linux-based, Windows-based, and so on? Right? Most of the world out there is still Windows, right? Windows Server. And that's, you're looking at the key workloads around Windows Server. And with the release of 2012 last year, there was more and more adoption of this. It's quite a good release. One thing I find about Microsoft product releases is they tend to have a good release, then a bad release, then a good release, and a bad release. You can see that with their clients. So you saw 2000 come out, XP. A lot of people are still running XP. But how many people you know running Vista out there? How many people you know running Windows 7? Kind of goes on and on. There was a Windows operating system called ME, Millennium Edition. How many people ran that? Probably not many. So really now we move on now and talk more about the platform features. So platform features is capabilities that we can build with these hypervisors. So things like scalable host clusters. Right, we want to be able to provide high availability. Our workloads should be mobile. And we use a term called live migration. A workload can move amongst our physical hosts. We can live migrate these. And what happens during a live migration? Well, we have two hosts, host A, host B, and we want to move the VM that's running on host A to host B. But we want to move it in a live fashion. Live fashion means we want zero downtime. We don't want that VM to stop working when we move it across. So when we move that VM across, what are we doing? We're moving the memory state of that VM across to the other side. So we move the memory state, we move the config over, and then it starts running on host B. All the time while the workload in that VM is still running. That's important to us, right? Because we want to be able to move our workloads around. So that's what live migration is. Storage migration is similar to live migration, but we're also not, instead of moving the memory state, we're moving where the VM is stored. So one thing I need to note about host clusters is that we need shared storage. So it needs to be stored on a SAN environment or some form of shared storage. So we have some other attributes that we want to compare them by. Network virtualization. This is very important for hosters. So we want to be able to provide virtual network environments for our different customers. For a hoster, they might have a number of customers, and they might have the same IP address subnets that they use. So how do you host these customers with the same IP addressing requirements on a single physical host? We need technologies like network virtualization. And the last one, a comprehensive management stack. So if we look at kind of where each of these vendors are, Microsoft and VMware, fairly much equal. There's one player here with fault tolerance where Microsoft doesn't really exist in that game. But fault tolerance is a special kind of feature that really wouldn't be used in most environments. Fault tolerance is when you have actually two hosts, exactly the same hardware spec, and a VM that is running on both hosts that are in synchronization with each other. So if you have a host failure, the VM never fails. So you have literally 100% uptime. But this technology has limitations, a lot of limitations. It'll be used in cases where, like a door access system shouldn't ever go down. Right? Otherwise, people can't get out of the building. So these situations, you would deploy fault tolerance. But one of the limitations was it could only have one virtual CPU, for instance. So you can't really scale it to being used for enterprise workloads, for instance. So what I highlighted here in red are those that I think are important if you're building a private cloud infrastructure. You need scalable clusters. You need to be able to have live migration. High availability. If we have unplanned downtime of a host, those running workloads on that host are automatically started on another host, for instance. Dynamic optimization. We want to clear out any hotspots in our clusters. So we don't want one host overly taxed with workloads. We want those workloads to be spread across all of our hosts in our cluster. And that's what dynamic optimization gives you. So it's a bit like load balancing. We want to make sure the utilization across all our hosts are about the same. Network virtualization, definitely a key one for hosters. And if you're doing private cloud, because what you could do here is you could have a production environment that uses production IPs. You could do a clone of that production environment and create your test environment using exactly the same IPs, but hosted on the same physical infrastructure. And lastly is the management stack. So because XenServer really doesn't have a comprehensive management stack, I took it out there. But really, again, you're looking at a two-horse race again, Microsoft and VMware. I mentioned before Windows Server is probably the most widely deployed operating system out there. Well, what do they deploy on Windows Server? Well, these are Microsoft workloads that typically you see on Windows Server workloads. So we talk about all the different Microsoft workloads, domain controllers, right? Go back to the time of Novell, who still remembers Novell directory services? I don't think there's many organizations running that. AD came along and kind of was the new directory service, and it's been that way ever since. But in terms of the Microsoft workloads here, all three platforms are fairly well supported. And there's something new in Windows 2012. And they introduced this new feature called VM Generation ID. And that basically means that virtualizing a domain controller, it's safe to virtualize a domain controller. So with domain controllers, we replicate using a multi-master. So every domain controller holds the exact same database. Now with virtualization technologies, you can actually do things like snapshot and roll back to a particular point in time. That's something you get with virtualization. Now that's very bad for domain controllers. You could potentially corrupt your whole domain by using the snapshot technologies. So Microsoft introduced this VM Generation ID to make sure that it's safe to virtualize domain controllers. So a domain controller is aware that it's being virtualized and will not roll back and corrupt the domain. That's basically in a nutshell. There's a lot more technical things behind that you can go to the Microsoft website to learn some more. So then we talk about the three key workloads. Exchange. Exchange can be virtualized. So the latest version can be virtualized. Previous versions there was limited support, but today there's a TechNet article which will actually show you how to virtualize Exchange and all roles within Exchange as well. SharePoint is the same, and then we talk about SQL. So SQL, this is one of the workloads that I found my customers had trouble virtualizing. They were always scared of virtualizing their database servers. You know, web servers I virtualize easily, domain controllers, file servers, but my database servers, they always had a concern. Well, SQL can be virtualized, and they have guidance from their website on how to virtualize virtualize SQL, and it's supported across all platforms. These articles are for all virtualization platforms. It's not specific to Microsoft. But there have been some third-party testing now. You might wonder, which platforms do these products run best on? Well, there was some third-party testing from a third-party provider And it did show that Microsoft does have better support for these workloads than others. But you tend to expect that, right? It's a Microsoft product running on Microsoft. Again, like Citrix before, Citrix has XenApp and XenDesktop. They run best on XenServer as well. So there's probably not any Microsoft product today that you can't virtualize. So that means if you can virtualize it, you can host it in your private cloud. And there's benefits to hosting it in your private cloud as well. They're mobile. You can easily replicate them. You can back them up as well. Okay, so let's consider Oracle now. So Oracle support. So let's consider it from two aspects. So we consider it from the support aspect and the licensing aspect. So now we've dropped, you notice I dropped Citrix out of the picture and put Oracle VM in there. There's a reason for this. So support, what does that mean? I want an Oracle database, I want to run it on a hypervisor. If I run it on a Microsoft, or let's say I run it on a VMware hypervisor. Now the support that I'm going to get from Oracle and VMware is that, actually sorry, this should be switched around. This should be Microsoft here, this should be VMware here. Just ignore the top. Okay, let's talk about Microsoft first. So Microsoft and Oracle entered this enterprise agreement on the 24th of June, a couple months ago. This is very important because it's saying that Oracle will now support their products directly on Hyper-V and also Azure. So Azure is the public cloud offering from Microsoft. If we compare that with the VMware and Oracle support policy, now VMware have a policy where they will support customers that run Oracle on VMware. But the support doesn't come from Oracle. It actually comes from VMware. VMware is supporting Oracle. So if you have a problem with your Oracle product on VMware, you call VMware support, and then they will coordinate with Oracle support. Which is, if you compare it here, it's direct. Microsoft doesn't get involved in the Oracle support. Customer can go direct to Oracle. So this is quite important because you eliminate the middleman here. You don't have to go to VMware to get Oracle support. And then Oracle VM, obviously Oracle gives full enterprise support there. So from a support perspective, you're getting better support from Microsoft now than you are from the VMware perspective. Now we talk about the licensing. And this is where Oracle actually gives a bit of an unfair advantage. They have a feature called, well, in their licensing statement they say if you can support hard partitioning. What hard partitioning is, it's pinning a vCPU, so a virtual CPU within a VM, to an actual core or a CPU on the physical socket. So when you do that, you only have to license that physical core. Whereas from a Microsoft and VMware perspective, they have something called soft partitioning, where they can actually say, okay, it can be assigned to one of these cores, or they don't actually specifically say this particular core. And because of this, when they license Oracle, they have to license all of the host CPUs. So your licensing costs when you host Oracle products on Hyper-V and VMware is going to be a lot more than, saying, putting your Oracle product on a Oracle VM platform and doing the CPU pinning. So in this sense, Oracle is kind of protecting themselves with offering lower license costs. And we all know how much Oracle can cost if you're looking at the enterprise editions. So that's something to consider when you're hosting Oracle workloads. One is from a support perspective. Am I supported, first of all? How am I supported? And also from a licensing perspective. How can I reduce my Oracle licensing costs, for instance? There's white papers all around this as well. VMware has a white paper on how to reduce those licensing costs as well. Okay, so SAP. Just highlight this because I've had some experience with SAP, VMware, Hyper-V as well. SAP, as a support statement, they support all three. They will give you support on all three virtualization platforms. And that's end-to-end support as well. So if you do have a problem and you're running any of these platforms, then do so. But you'll find most of them are running on VMware or Microsoft. One of my first customers actually started running SAP on the first generation of Windows 2008 Hyper-V. And I remember how buggy it was, but they stuck with it, and now they've benefited from that by having that virtualized. And all the other workloads, well, there's too many to mention. But the key things to remember here is check with the vendor. Do you have a support statement for supporting this on this particular platform? Some do, some don't. Some might support VMware, some might support Microsoft, and not the others. But only the vendor would know. The thing is, it probably can be virtualized. In most cases, it can be virtualized if you could live without the support. I haven't found many workloads today that can't be virtualized. But there are some legacy apps, and I can give an example here, Cognos, back to the old early versions that didn't run very well on a virtualization platform. And really, what you select as a platform depends on what features that you require. One last point is USB COM ports. Now, USB COM ports are connected directly to the servers. So you think, can I virtualize this do I have a virtualized COM port, virtualized USB? But then it's tied to that physical server. So if I move that workload, how is that physical connection to the USB going to follow me? So to get around this, you look for devices like COM port servers or USB port servers. So that basically provide USB connections over an IP connection, for instance. Then you can move your workloads around. Okay, so that's the features and support. Let's look at a scenario about cost now. So how do we compare the three platforms from a cost perspective? Now, the costs I'm using here are all recommended retail pricing. So, obviously a customer is going to get discount based on their volumes, but just for a comparison, they're all recommended retail pricing. So we have a P cloud here. What is a P cloud? Well, that's my private cloud. So my private cloud here consists of 10 hosts. Right, 10 hosts, 10 physical hosts, which have the spec as follows: 2 sockets and 196 gig of RAM. Quite a bit of RAM. I want to host a lot of these workloads on this 10 hosts. So in my P cloud, I've got a mixture of Windows workloads and Linux workloads, but I have more Windows workloads than Linux workloads. So that's what my environment. That's what I want to license. So let's see how we license this against the three platforms. Okay, so how I'm going to do this is I'm going to compare Citrix, Microsoft, and VMware. You can see the links down there for the actual pricing, so you can go to those links and see the actual pricing. So I'm going to license this in 3 components: the guest VMs, the management stack. Obviously, management stack is important to me because I need to manage my 10 hosts, and the host, so the physical hardware. So the guest VMs, well, the guest VMs are Windows workloads. So Microsoft has this policy where the licensing for your guest VMs is actually based on your host. So you assign a license to your host, and you can be licensed for X number of virtual machines. So Microsoft licensing comes in 2 flavors. It comes in Data Center Edition and Standard Edition. So Data Center Edition allows me to license unlimited number of VMs running Windows. Standard Edition allows me to license up to 2 VMs running Windows. Linux is out of the picture because that's Linux licensing. But because I'm running mainly Windows licensing, I need to buy what I call a Data Center Edition license and assign it to my host for me to run unlimited VMs running Windows on my host. There's a cost equation as well, the cost of the standard versus the cost of the data center. By the time you hit about 6 or 7, I think it's about 8 VMs on a host, it's more cost effective to buy data center. Because you can, if you had 8 VMs on a host, I could buy data center or I could buy 4 times standard. Get the picture here, because standard includes 2 VMs. I have 8 VMs, I do 4 licenses. So here we buy Data Center Edition and assign that to the host. So we have 10 hosts, and each Data Center Edition, let me clarify here, Data Center Edition covers 2 sockets. So these servers have 2 sockets. If I had a server with 4 sockets, how many licenses would I need? Double it, 2. So two licenses covers 4 sockets, for instance. So we buy 10 of these licenses. This is the cost per license, and this price is actually going up when R2 gets released in October. So if you're going to buy any Windows Server licenses, you buy them now before the price increase. So that's across the board. So each of these platforms you have to pay for. Now, we look at the management stack now. So we have XenServer. XenCenter is free. You don't have to pay any money for it, but it's quite a limited management tool. In the Microsoft line, we have a product called System Center 2012, and that consists of a number of different products. And this product helps us kind of monitor our virtual infrastructure. It does a lot more than that as well. But we look at Data Center Edition here as well because we want unlimited management. The licensing model for System Center is the same as Windows Server, either standard or Data Center. Standard covers 2, Data Center covers unlimited. So that's the cost for our management. VMware, they have a vCenter server, so you manage using this vCenter server there. You can see the cost there. And then lastly, we look at the Hypervisor platform itself. So Citrix just recently updated their support, so we want support from them. It's licensed by CPU, so we have 20 CPUs, and that's the support cost per CPU. Well, Microsoft, because we already have the data center license up here, it's already covered, so we don't have any cost down here. And VMware is charged by socket. So they have 20 sockets because there's 10 machines with 2 sockets. So 20 sockets times this price. And when you add it all up, well, Citrix is actually slightly cheaper than all the rest. But I think Citrix is not as you saw from the previous slides, isn't in the same league as Microsoft and VMware. Right. And there's actually a special licensing where if you buy Data Center, System Center here, and Windows Server together, you can actually get up to 20% discount on that. So you buy the management plus the OS, you can get the license cheaper. And then if you do that, it's actually cheaper than Citrix. But the thing to note here is you don't have to pay for your hypervisor. VMware, you have to pay for your hypervisor. Citrix, you still have to pay for your hypervisor if you want support. And then we look at the management stack. You're getting a lot more with System Center than you are with vCenter Server Edition as well. So it's just a kind of a cost comparison, a 10 node cluster. You can actually do your own and do an ROI across 5 years. But in most cases, you'll find that Microsoft comes out cheaper. Citrix comes out the cheapest. But from a kind of a deployment point of view, the 2-horse race here, Microsoft and VMware. So really, in summary, what we're seeing is there's good support across the board for these 3 type of hypervisors. So really, you can't really go wrong if you select one of these as your virtualization platform for your private cloud. They've got good support for Linux and Windows. And really, where you'd select XenServer over the others would be if you're doing a lot of Citrix deployments, so XenApp, XenDesktop. VDI, for instance, runs really well on XenServer. It's optimized for VDI, XenServer. And this is what I'm finding as well. We're doing some XenDesktop deployments, VDI deployments, and using XenServer we can see a lot more performance gains in that. A lot of Linux support as well if you're looking at that, and it is simple to deploy. Hyper-V. Hyper-V makes sense if you're a pure Microsoft shop because you're going to get Microsoft support across the board for all the different products. It does have a very comprehensive management stack as well. And one of the key benefits of actually deploying Microsoft is you've got a future product roadmap to Azure. Azure is the public cloud offering from Microsoft. So if you wanted to shift a virtual machine on Hyper-V today to the cloud, Azure, you can do it as easy as just copying the VHD file from here to up there and it will run. Because it's the same file format used, both on-premise for your private cloud as well as public cloud. And VMware, vSphere, well, if cost isn't an issue to you, you have an open checkbook, then yeah, by all means, it is the market leader still. It is a proper enterprise platform for virtualization. It has those features and performance in there as well. And the other thing is, most people forget, is if I'm going to deploy something, I need engineers to help me support it. So there's a lot more VMware engineers out there than there are Hyper-V engineers, for instance. So you're going to get a big pool of support to support your environment if you do deploy private cloud. So those are kind of the considerations. I don't really have a preference for all of these. Having deployed all three in my kind of my line of work, I choose basically the hypervisor that meets customer requirements and then recommend based on that. And that's what a good consultant should do. They look at requirements and they propose the most suitable solution. So really, looking at just the private cloud here, this is what we've been focusing on today. But really, it's a journey to the cloud. And what we'll see more and more in this, as we go along and with IT, is there'll be a huge drive for public cloud offering as well. You can see some of the players here: Office 365, Amazon Web Services, Google's in there as well. We could go to service providers here in Singapore, service providers that are global service providers. So we're going to see a blurring of the lines here. Do we host the workload here in our private cloud? Do we move it to our service provider, or do we even put that in the hybrid cloud, in the public cloud? But if we're going to do that, we want a platform that allows us to be consistent. So move these workloads around quite easily between all these different environments. And that's one key area that Microsoft has over the others, is it can move those out. The VHD file that is here can run in here, can run in here. VMware can run in here and in here. You see OpenStack here. So Microsoft are really kind of moving forward with the journey to the cloud. They're kind of committed to Azure services here, and service providers picking up their Microsoft stack. So in summary then, really what we're looking at is a two-horse race when it comes to virtualization platforms. It's Microsoft or VMware. And I think in Singapore, more than anything else, cost is always a consideration. But cost isn't the only consideration. I think in Singapore, brand takes a bigger step sometimes. I've walked into some customers and they look at the brand. VMware is a very strong brand. It's been around for a long time. Microsoft hasn't been in the virtualization game that long. The brand also comes into play here. In terms of features and support, they're fairly much even. Again, it depends on requirements. In terms of workloads you want to virtualize today, they should all be able to be virtualized. Do your homework first. Check with the application vendor. And then also consider, does it need to go on private cloud? Can it go on hybrid cloud? Half in the public, half in the private, or even a hosted cloud? And the last thing I want to leave you with is that the management is actually more important than the hypervisor. So there's this quote by this Gartner analyst called Tom Bittman, who said that virtualization without good management is more dangerous than not using virtualization in the first place. And that's more true than anything else today. Like before, when we had traditional environments, you could walk up to a server and say, that's my SQL server. And you could walk up to this server and say, that's my file server. But with virtualization, can you walk up to your server in your data center and go, I think my file server's on there? Because it could be, but then the next moment it could be here. So how do you know where your servers are? Well, that's where the management stack comes into play. You have to have a good management stack. And all of the platforms have management stacks. You just have to evaluate which meet your requirement better than the others. And really, it's not just about the hypervisor as well. You've got to consider not just the technology, but people and processes as well. That completes the picture to move to the private cloud, the journey to the private cloud. Okay. So really what I'll leave you with is some useful links. That's my email address up there if you want to email me, or you can collect a business card from me later. Like I said, I'm part of the Enterprise Cloud Computing and Virtualization SIG for SCS, so you're welcome to join there on this link. We do regularly try to organize events around cloud computing and have meaningful conversations about cloud and virtualization. If you want to learn more about VMware or Microsoft, Microsoft actually has a lot of free training online, and VMware has some links as well. So all of this is free training. You can learn about Microsoft technologies and VMware. The Citrix website is also a good source of information as well. So with that, that kind of concludes my session for today. Do we have any questions? Right. All kind of firmly set on what kind of hypervisor to select for your private cloud. I think what I'm seeing today is, selecting a product is important, but looking at the big picture. Where do I eventually want to host my workload? Is it on-premise? Is it something on a hosted cloud? Or is it public cloud? And that's the conversations I'm having with customers and partners today.